Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, and in today's video I'm going to be installing iBox Pro lowering springs on this 2023 Gr86. These lowering springs are going to lower the ride height as well as help increase handling performance. So I'm going to get the car up in the air and bring you guys along, showing you the install process. So I want to give you guys a quick look at what the car looks like stock. Right now it's got the stock wheel and tire package as well as stock ride height. So the front bumper is about 6 inches off the ground, and there's quite a big gap in between the fenders and the tires. So it's about, 3.5, 4 fingers on both sides. So the front as well as the rear. So after I install the lowering springs, we should see that gap kind of shrink. So we'll see how much of a difference visually it makes. Additionally, I'll also provide you guys with some insight on how it handles and things of that nature. So I'm gonna get this car on ramps, jack it up, get it in the air, and we're gonna start with the front, and I'm gonna pull these wheels off and get to the install. So we'll get right to it. So as you can see, I have the car secured on these low profile ramps, which will allow enough access for me to slide my low profile jack into the center lift point. So I'm going to throw a wheel chock in the back, and I'm going to lift up the car from the front cross member, which will allow me to lift the front end up evenly. And then I'm going to throw jack stands under the car, and I'll get these wheels off, and then they'll gain me access to the rest and what I need to do to get the struts out. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and remove these wheels, and we'll get right into the next step. So I figured I'd show you guys what you get in the box with the iBox Pro lowering spring kit. So you get an iBox sticker as well as some warranty paperwork and some installation paperwork. This shows you that you do reuse the OEM bump stop. I'm not sure if you cut it yet or not, but I'll be sure to update you guys when we get to that point. Additionally, you can see the springs right here. They're black in color. Pretty simple, nothing to write home about, but I'm gonna swap these with the OEM ones, and these will give you the drop that we need to make it look a little bit better, as well as hopefully handle a little bit better. So just a quick overview of what's in the box. I'll get back to installing the rest of this. I'm gonna do the front first and then the rear. Doesn't really matter which order you do it in, but personally I like to start with the front, so that's what I'm gonna do. So we'll get right into that. So now I have the front of the vehicle lifted up, secured on jack stands, as well as a wheel chock in the rear. Now I'm gonna remove the front 2 wheels and gain access to the suspension components, and I'll get right into the removal of the struts. Now that I have the wheel out of the way, which was held on by 5 19mm lug nuts, you can see the suspension components. Right here is the strut, which is what we're going to try to be removing to replace this spring right here with the iBox lowering spring. I already went ahead and sprayed some PB Blaster on these bolts to help with breaking them free. But to start, I'm going to remove these 2 connectors from the strut assembly. Simply use a pry tool to pull these off. You don't want to forget the brake line bracket right here and release this brake line so you don't have any tension, or you're not doing it while all the components are out. So this is one 12mm bolt, and then you have 2 19mm bolts to hold the knuckle to the strut, and then one, I believe, 17mm bolt that holds the sway bar end link. So it's pretty simple. I'm going to start by removing those connectors, that simple 12mm bolt to hold the brake line, the end link, and then the last bolts I'm going to remove are these 3 top hat bolts, which are all 12mm. Also, it's nice to have a jack handy to support this hub while the strut is removed. That way you're not fighting it, or it's not being held on by the lower ball joint and the end link or the tie rod. So definitely add some support on that, but simply it's just these 2 bolts, this end link bolt, 2 connectors, and a bolt here. Additionally, the 3 nuts on top. So it's very simple. If you've done any suspension job, it's not too complicated. There's no special tools needed. So I'm going to go ahead, break these bolts free, kind of talk you through it. And once I get the strut out, then I'll get to installing the new strut, or the new spring onto the strut, which is all fairly simple stuff. So we'll get right into it. So for these two connectors located right here, I'm going to simply use this generic pry tool and carefully pry these clips off without breaking them.
There's one.
And there's the other. So you just want to make sure this is out of the way, kind of free from, getting caught up by anything. Now I'm just going to head to this 12mm bolt that holds this brake line in, and I'm going to break that free. Since this car is fairly new, it's pretty easy to break all these bolts loose, but I like to use some sort of penetrating oil to help with the removal process. Just gonna make sure the brake line is out of the way, as well as these cables. For safekeeping, I'm gonna thread this back into the strut. That way I don't lose it. While I'm here, I'm going to loosen these two 19mm. I'm going to use an impact. I highly recommend an impact. If you don't have an impact, you can use a long breaker bar, as well as hold the other end of the bolt with a socket to break them free. But I'm going to try using an impact first. So as you can see with the wheel turned, it's going to give me a little bit more space to reach these. Now you have a better view also of these two clips that plug into right here and right here, as well as the brake line that I moved out of the way. So now I'm going to try to get this last bottom bolt, or the last of the knuckle bottom bolt, out. So that broke free pretty easily. I'm gonna go ahead, go back in the car, straighten out the wheel. I have these two bolts still threaded. I'm gonna make sure these are out of the way when I turn the wheel. And I'm just gonna straighten out this assembly again. So now with those two bolts loose, I'm gonna go head over to the sway bar end link bolt and break that one loose. I'm also gonna use the impact for that. So as you can see, it's this bolt right here. If it begins to spin, you can throw a hex in it and use a open end wrench, but I should be able to get it broken free with just using an impact. So now that that's broken free, I'm gonna just pull this bolt out and put it in a safe location. So now with the tie rod disconnected, my wires disconnected, the brake hose disconnected, I'm gonna remove these two bolts that I broke free previously. Before I remove them completely, I'm gonna put a jack under the hub assembly and support it. So as you can see, once you remove these last bolts, the strut kind of spins freely. So you just want to make sure everything's out of the way with the lines. And now all I have to do is loosen the top 3 12mm bolts. So while you do this, if you have a friend that can hold the strut, if not, remove them hand tight while supporting it with your hand and then you can pull out the strut assembly. So after removing the strut, or those last 3 bolts for the top hat, the strut, I picked it up and put it on the bench. So now all that's left to do is use my spring compressors, compress the spring, remove the top hat bolt, and then replace it with the Eibach lowering spring. So I'm gonna get right into that, show you guys what I use and what I do to get that out and put the new spring in. So with the spring laying like this, I'm gonna pop off this top cap. It's just a rubber piece, you can pry it off. If you can't get it with your hands, then you can kind of slide a flathead underneath. And that's gonna reveal this top hat. And this is a 17mm bolt that you're gonna have to get off. I'm gonna use an impact to zip it off, but if it starts spinning, you can throw an Allen head and use an offset wrench to loosen this bolt. But before I do that, I'm gonna put spring compressors on it and get this spring compressed. That way there's no load on this strut assembly. So now that I have the spring compressed enough, I'm going to loosen this top 17mm with the impact wrench. It's also worth noting, when you do this, even with the spring compressor, I like to point this in a direction that's not going to damage anything, and it's kind of a safe direction. So I'm going to do that while I loosen this. So now with the spring decompressed or compressed and off of the strut, you have the OEM strut housing here, the OEM spring, dust cover, top piece, as well as the OEM top hat with that 17mm nut we just took off. So I'm going to put this assembly to the side. I'm going to remove the spring compressors and decompress this OEM spring, and then get to the installation of the Eibach spring. So one thing worth mentioning is that when you decompress or compress the spring with these spring clamps, or at least that style in particular, you want to do it evenly. Otherwise you risk binding the spring and it makes it difficult to either decompress or recompress the spring. So make sure you do it evenly on both sides. I don't know if it's recommended to use an impact, so do your own research, but when you're loosening it, you want to make sure that you do it evenly. So now that this tension is off the spring, I'm going to pull the OEM dust boot out, as well as this top piece. Sometimes these get stuck, so you might have to pry on it. So now with the top piece off, I'm gonna go put this OEM spring aside and start working on reinstalling the Eibach spring to the stock OEM strut. So as you can see, here's the Eibach spring. When you install this, you wanna make sure the Eibach is straight up and down with the strut so that you can read it correctly, and that will be the correct orientation. But before I do this, I'm going to go modify the OEM bump stock. That way you retain the factory travel in the shock. So I put the OEM spring in the box, and now right in front of me I have the Eibach spring. This will be the replacement, and it's going to go in this position so that you can read it onto the strut. But before that, you want to remove the dust cover and gain access to the bump stop. Now the directions call that you cut this last ear off. This is a soft rubber or like poly material. It's foam. So You can use a standard box cutter, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to cut this last ear off. That way you maintain the OEM travel in the shock itself. So you want to cut this off and then place it back on the shock absorber along with this dust cover. And then I'm going to compress this eye box spring, put it on the strut, make sure this top piece aligns correctly. This is the end, and that should correspond with the end to the spring. Additionally, you want to make sure the bottom also corresponds with the bottom of the strut. So we're going to have that all set up, but now it's just cutting off this ear to modify the stop, put this all together, and then I'll be able to reinstall this whole strut assembly back into the car. So it's a little bit difficult to see, but I have the top hat bolt tightened, and now I'm going to evenly loosen the spring compressor and allow this to decompress. But also you want to make sure that you're watching to make sure these ends are in the right corresponding spots. So once this is all installed, I'm going to quickly torque this top bolt, and then I'll be ready for reinstallation. So now with the spring compressors removed, you can see the eye box springs are installed, and now this strut is ready to go back into the vehicle. So now that the strut has been assembled with the new eye box lowering springs, I can just put them back in the vehicle, and the installation process is reverse of the removal. So I'm going to start by wiggling the strut into position, and I'm going to finger tighten the top 3 top hat bolts. That way it's secured, and then I can work on aligning everything else on the bottom. So now that I have those 3 bolts hand tight, I'm going to be able to align everything else under the vehicle, and then I'll go around each and every bolt and make sure they're torqued to spec. But as of now, I have it in place, so now I'm going to go back down below and line up everything else. So as you can see in the previous clip, I torqued all the bolts. So I torqued these 3 top hat bolts, replaced the rubber boot on top of the strut assembly. Moving along down here, I made sure everything down here was torqued and in the correct position. So I torqued the sway bar end link, torqued these 2 knuckle bolts. Something to note is that when you're torquing these down, if you don't have a wrench on this side, it might spin. In my case, it didn't, so I was able to torque these to spec. But if it does, just throw a wrench on this end. And make sure these 2 clips were clipped in for the ABS and routed correctly. And then don't forget this brake line holder, so put that 12mm bolt back in, and then you're completely done with the front end. So I have my eye box lowering spring in, and now all that's left is to throw this wheel on, and I'll be headed to the next side, which is the rear, which should be a little bit easier. So I already did the driver's side. It's the exact same process as I just highlighted here, so just kind of mirror that on that side. But once you do this, I'm gonna throw this wheel on and we'll get right into the rear, so I'll show you that. So I just wrapped up torquing the front wheels, and I'm going to remove the chock, get it off the ramp slowly, and then I'll be able to start with the rear install for the eye box springs. Before I get in the car to move it, I'm going to clean up my hands. So Karen, if you're watching this, that's the owner of the car. Don't worry, I'm not going to touch it with my greasy hands. So I'm going to wash up, get the car off these ramps, and then start with the rear install. So we're almost there. The car looks amazing right now, so we'll get right to it. So moving right along, I have the car up in the air. I have it secured with jack stands. I didn't have to use the low profile ramps for the rear, so I was able just to jack it up from the center and put jack stands on either end. So I already did the passenger side, so now I'm going to do the driver's side. It's a really easy process. The front wasn't bad at all, and the rear is really easy, so this shouldn't take too long. I'm going to pull off this wheel, and then I'll give you guys a better look at what to do. So now with the tire out of the way, you can see the rear strut that you want to remove. And to remove this, it's very simple. There's 2 bolts inside, which I'll show you in a little bit. But for the bottom, you have 1, 2, 3. These 3 nuts and bolts all get removed, and you'll be able to remove the strut. Luckily, they're easily accessible. So these 2 are 17 mils, and this last one's a 14 mil. So you have the lower control arm bolt to the knuckle. You have the shock to the lower control arm bolt, and then you have just the sway bar and link bolt. So you remove these 3, and you'll be able to free the lower control arm enough to pull out the strut, and then you can just swap the spring in. So it's a very simple process, very similar to the front of the car, actually a little bit more simpler, honestly. But after or before we get into this, we're going to go inside the trunk, remove a couple panels to gain access to the 2 bolts that hold this shock in, and then we'll get right to it. So I'm gonna hop in the trunk and show you guys what to look for. So headed into the trunk, I decided to remove the floor mat and the liner. This isn't really 100% necessary, but it gives me more space to show you guys. I also dropped the rear seats, but this is also a process that's not necessary. I'm just doing it for demonstration and to get some better light, but feel free to follow my steps. So back here, you only have a few plastic clips. Luckily, these haven't broken on me, so they're pretty high quality. If you know anything about interior clips, usually it's a pain, but these came out pretty good on the other side, so I expect nothing different here. So I'm gonna get some light. So as you can see, you have a whole bunch of these clips. You can remove them all, but I find that if you remove this 1, 2, 3, and 4 down here, remove those 4 clips, it gives you enough room to pull this back and get access to the top of the shock. So I'm gonna remove these clips with some simple tools, some simple interior trim removal tools, and then I'll show you guys what you see after you remove these and get them out of the way. So here's a better look at the 2 bolts that you'll be loosening. They're both 14 mils, so you can loosen them now. So I'm gonna loosen them hand tight now, and then once I'm ready to uninstall the strut, then I'm going to come back up and loosen them all the way, take them out, and then that'll make dropping the strut very easy and simple. So I'm gonna go back under here. I'm going to unbolt these 3 bolts that I talked about earlier, and then go back up, and just those 2 bolts, and the strut is gonna be free and ready to pull out of the car. So now that I removed the top hat bolts up top, the rest of the removal and installation is going to start with the bottom. So I'm going to remove these 3 bolts that I talked about earlier. And just like that, the shock is removed. So now that I have the rear shock removed from the vehicle, I'm now going to pretty much do the same process to remove the spring as I did on the front of the car. So I'm going to use the spring compressors evenly on both ends, compress the OEM spring, and then remove the single top hat bolt. And then I'll be good to start the process on installing the Eibach spring onto the OEM shock. So I'll get right to it. So now that that bolt's removed, I'm going to carefully pop the top hat off and place it to the side. And pull out the OEM shock and set it to the side. So before I begin, like the front, we have to cut the bump stop. This will allow for the full suspension travel of the factory shock. So we're going to pull this off, and we're going to cut off 1 ear of this rubber boot, or this foam bump stop. So I'm going to use a razor blade like I did for the front of the car, and I'm going to cut this boot off and put it back in. So as you can see, with it removed, I'm just going to cut this off and then put it right back in. Now with the OEM bump stop modified, I'm going to put the eye-box spring in the correct location and make sure the perch lines up with the spring. So now the rear strut is completely assembled and ready to go back into the car. So I'm going to go back to the car, slide this in, and the installation is just like the removal, but backwards. So it's going to be very straightforward and very easy of an install. So let's get right to it. So now I'm going to just angle and position the strut with the new Eibach lowering spring back into position. So now after putting all the interior back together and the trunk, I'm going to just put the final wheel back on, torque it to spec, and then I'll be able to drop the car down and the install and the whole lowering spring job will be complete. So it's the following day. I decided to pull the car out in the sun to give you guys a better look at what the car looks like with the Eibach lowering springs fully installed. So as you can see, the front gap between the fender and the tire is a lot less than it was OEM. So it dropped it quite a bit and it looks really nice. Same thing goes for the rear. The gap is dropped substantially. So overall, I'm really happy with the way it looks aesthetically. It'll probably drop down another 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch once it settles. But overall, with some aftermarket wheels, the car will look really good. And even with the OEM wheels right now, it looks pretty good, a lot lower. So we'll see how it handles. But overall, I'm really happy with the results. So just decided to give you guys a little update in the daytime. But as you can see, it dropped it quite a bit and it looks pretty good. So I'm satisfied. So as you guys can see, the Gr86 is sitting a lot lower now thanks to the Eibach springs. The install was pretty straightforward, and I hope this video helped you guys at home that are doing it. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.